Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Gary Matsuoka, and this is Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. And today's topic class is on what is perfect soil. And that is one of those new, relatively recently controversial topics that we're trying to correct what the industry thinks of perfect soil. Because everything you buy in a bag nowadays is not really dirt. It says garden soil, it says potting soil. These things are so far from real dirt that we can't believe that they're allowed to sell them as, say, quote, soil. And because of that, because these things aren't really dirt, they don't act like dirt. We're having a lot of problems with plants. The people who are supposed to know have invented new terms to reasons why the plants are failing in it. So today we hope to be able to tell you, I'll explain to you what's going on here. So the role of soil on plants, and generally, well, let's do what the plant requires some dirt. So if you have a plant and it's growing in the soil, what does the plant need from the soil? Well, number one, and this is obvious, is water. It needs to be able to retain some moisture around the roots of the plant. Generally, if the plant's awake and it's got green leaves and it's growing, that soil's got to be pretty much wet. Uh, and I'll explain to you how it does that. But the roots on plants are not covered. Most of the plant is on the above ground parts of the plant are covered in wax, and they have little openings where they can exchange water and gases. But most of the plant's covered in wax so that it can hold on to its moisture. The roots aren't; they're free to pull the moisture in that's in the ground. So number one is water. Number two, which is not talked about very much, oops, two here, is gas exchange. So what is not talked about very much is the roots are like we are. The roots of a plant consume oxygen and they give off carbon dioxide just like we do. We breathe in oxygen, give off carbon dioxide. The parts of the plant that make oxygen are the chloroplasts in the green leaves, or any part of the plant that's green has chloroplasts in there. And those chloroplasts, which are very similar to blue-green algae in nature, um, take in carbon dioxide, water, and energy of sunlight, and they produce sugar and and oxygen in the reverse in that process of photosynthesis. They're creating sugar and oxygen. So there's plenty of oxygen in the leaves, and they do transfer a little bit through their sap, but the roots are so far away they don't have enough. They've got to get it through the soil. So the soil has to be able to exchange oxygen. So for that reason, um, you know, in the old days when I was a kid, and when you folks were kids, they used to show a picture of a tree with the roots exactly the mirror image of the tree where the roots would be down here. But now they know that the soil can only, the air can only penetrate the soil about a foot in the cities. And that's why you see when trees fall over in a wind or in a rainstorm, this much dirt comes up with them because they're not any deeper than that. They can't breathe any deeper than about a foot. Out in nature, it's like a foot and a half. That's about it. The only time they go deeper than that is if they're like, well, a friend of mine who's a geologist, he said, yeah, if they have fractured earthquake zone, fractured rock, they'll find roots 200 foot down in that because the air can get down there. Or, in the lava tubes in Hawaii, the rock is so airy or it's got so many air holes in it, you'll find them hanging through the roof of a lava tube or in a canyon that's filled with essentially gravel. They said they found tree roots next to in steep gorges 25-foot deep in the gravel. So if the air can get down there, the roots will follow. But if the air can't do it, the roots will stay where they can breathe. So number two, and that's real important, is the gas exchange. They need to be able to breathe. Number three, insulation. This is quite important. The roots like to be above freezing and below 95, right, 90 degrees, really. They don't like to be above 90. And supposedly, unless you're high in the mountains, the soil in the lower 48 states of the United States never freezes below a few inches. So that keeps most plants alive. You know, if you go up to Alaska and you're in permafrost, most plants are killed by that. Just a layer of ice in the soil. But here in the lower 48 states, there's no areas except maybe high on mountains that's the ground actually freezes. So the ground is very insulating. Um, Number four is stability. It keeps the plants upright. You don't want them falling over. They don't want to fall over. Now we've taken off this, as we put down here nutrition, but for most of the plants we know of, they do not use the soil for nutritional purposes. They get water, but nutrition is not part of the mix. Yet most soils that are sold in bags, their promotion is real rich nutrient value to our soil. So they're selling you essentially fertilizer rather than real dirt. So, but this is the main things that the soil has to do. Now, how does soil do that? Now, I've got a sample. Of course, here's decomposed granite. So, well, I didn't bring my rock up here. So, essentially, soil is ground up granite. You know what a piece of granite looks like? It's a rock that's mostly got white and then some darker specks, either brown or gray specks in it. And granite is this, the light parts of granite are quartz, just like glass is quartz, but it's quartz. And the dark specks are called feldspar, which when that granite is ground up in nature, it becomes the clay. So that's how you get brownish soil. It's due to some iron content in the feldspar, but generally, you know, if it's real light soil, that's mostly quartz. So that's what's so, you know, when the granites are breaking up, you know, most of the earth is covered in granite. There's some areas that are not granite, but granite and is silicon dioxide. And they said that rock formed because of a lot of oxygen in our atmosphere. That rock formed. If you go to the real ancient areas of the earth where they know the rocks are billions of years old, you won't find that much quartz because there wasn't any oxygen in those days. Not until blue-green algae and plants came on Earth, there wasn't that much oxygen. And after that, the volcanoes spew a lot of quartz, or there's a lot of quartz being formed in the Earth. So as these granite blocks fall down the sides of mountains, they first go into pieces that are kind of chunky, and we call it decomposed granite. And then once the rivers get to it, goes in the river and they get all churned up and uh, they form rounder pieces of sand, salt, and then clay. So sandy loam is after they've been in the river for a while, decomposed granites before they get in the river. But you'll see a lot of this on the hills, like in Temecula, the mountains and back here, and then a lot of this by the riverbeds. So sandy loam, well, the term loam, okay, turn the page here. So this is what plants need. You know, I will mention of course, a lot of plants vary in their needs for water. I mean, we know tomato plants can pull, um, can really suck a lot harder on the soil to pull water out than, say, a gardenia plant. Gardenias can't suck as hard as tomatoes. So some plants are better at pulling water out of dry soil than others. But gas exchange plants vary greatly in the amount of oxygen they need in their root system to stay healthy. And on the plants I brought in, these are the plants that need more oxygen in their roots. these are the plants that can tolerate lower oxygen levels. And you can see the plants that are easier to grow are on this side. The plants that are more difficult are on this side because of our current practices now of eliminating the oxygen in the soil. Compost does that, planter mixes do that. The potting soils and the garden soils they sell are depleted of oxygen. So all these things on this side are really kind of difficult to grow. Um, and when the oxygen level drops low, it promotes on these plants root rot. And of course, the garden center employee will tell you, "Oh, you watered it too much." It has nothing to do with root rot. So root rot is, well, of course it's got to be some moisture to get root rot, but root rot diseases are promoted by a lack of oxygen either in the soil or in the water. I mean, the thing about water is water out of our tap by law has to be 5 to 7 parts per million oxygen. So if you have a million water molecules, 5 to 7 of those there has to be 5 to 7 oxygen molecules in there so that you don't kill your plants when you turn on the sprinklers. So, especially drip systems, because they're not aerating the water as it comes out. So, the water districts know they got this is by law, they have to have that much oxygen because if they don't put that in there, you put this water in your fish bowl, it kills the fish, no oxygen. Fish have to breathe oxygen in the water. So, these plants need a lot of oxygen in the water. These plants, like pear trees, one of the best we know of, 2 parts per million. You can go down to that level and still be alive. But our textbooks say, yeah, bird of paradise, pear trees, roses. Now, some plants we think just adapt to low oxygen real fast. I don't think roses like low oxygen, but they have the ability to re-establish the roots very quickly near the surface of the ground where they breathe better. We've seen that in our own garden where all the roots are in the top few inches of soil and all the ones that are deeper than that die off. There's not enough oxygen. But lilies generally need very little oxygen. Most grasses don't need much oxygen. Palm trees can get by on low oxygen. They like oxygen. They say the Palm Society says palms grow best in sand because it has a lot of air in it. But they can tolerate pretty low. Daisies in general tolerate low. Impatiens, interestingly, can tolerate real low oxygen, whereas on the other side, begonias have a hard time with low oxygen level. That's why impatiens were much more popular than begonias because we were ruining the soil with all the planter mixes we were putting in there, and these would have more trouble. I mean, among the famous plants that people know, gardenias. But the worst we've seen is lavender. So now and then my daughter will buy lavender from one of our growers, and within a month or so they do that because the soil is not correct soil. And then within a year or so they just rot, or even sometimes within months they just rot away. Whereas when we grow lavender, it's much better colors. Um, you can water them you can water this, you can set this in water, it's not going to rot. There's nothing here that's promoting rot. Whereas everybody else tells you, well, the nationwide message to homeowners is the main problem with your garden is you overwater because everybody's losing their plants to root rot, and it's because the growers don't use real dirt or anything that resembles dirt in here, and that's promoting the root rot. It's not that they're watering too much because we've taken, the most sensitive tree to root rot is avocado. And most people have trouble with avocados because they're not buying from us. But almost everybody's seen an avocado pit thrown in a glass of water. there's no drainage in that glass. Drainage is way overrated. You don't need drainage to have oxygen around the roots.
Yeah.
So clean water in a jar or cup has plenty of oxygen. There's nothing dead in the water, and the water circulates around that cup. So an avocado can live in a glass of water for years. We've seen them, 2, 3 foot tall in a glass of water. But they are promoted as one of the most rot-prone trees we know of. It's, water can play a role in it, but you can have an avocado tree you can grow it hydroponically. If you really wanted to, you can grow it hydroponically. So we have there's a big problem between hydroponics and regular gardening. Some people think, well, hydroponics is so far out there, it's that thing about it's real. Well, all the principles of hydroponics are the same as in your garden. They have to follow the same principles. Plenty of oxygen in the water and all that. So hydroponics is just another form of gardening with a different type of soil, but all the principles are the same that we work with. So these are the important things. Now, how does real dirt provide this? Now, there's a couple terms to know that are real important. One is porosity. The other's permeability. And most journalists and horticulturists get these two terms mixed up. They'll tell you, oh, clay pots are better because they breathe. They're real porous. No, clay pots are very porous because they absorb water. Clay absorbs water like a sponge. Uh, Permeability is the ability for things to breathe. So gas exchange is important there. Now, soils are normally considered called loam if they have all. Now, I've heard this one is so bad too. So I've seen a lot of articles where they say make your soil a real rich loam by adding a whole bunch of compost to it till it turns nice and black, and then you know it's rich. It's like if you go by the definitions of what that means, you just killed your soil. If your soil turns black because of compost, the blackness is due to sewer gases, which are deadly to your plants. So you just wiped out your whole garden by adding a whole bunch of compost to it. And for some reason, they don't know, most horticulturists don't know what rich black soil, how it's created. We'll go over that too. Anyway, loam means that soil has all the ingredients that make up normal soil. And that's sand, silt, and clay. Everybody knows what sand is. Sand varies in size from fairly fine to very coarse. This is very coarse sand here. It's about 1 millimeter down to a tenth of a millimeter or something like that. I don't recall the exact thing, but you know what sand is. You go to the beach and that's sand. Silt and sand is pretty much quartz. There are areas where it's not quartz, but like the black sand beaches at Hawaii. Silt is just a smaller piece of sand. So sand is a relatively round piece. Silt is a relatively round piece that's a lot smaller than that. And clay are little flakes of feldspar which have a totally different shape. Think cornflakes or confetti. They're real flat flakes that are smaller than the silt. Clay particles you can't see. They're too small to see the outline. You can't see them. You can see sand. Silt's getting hard to see too because the size is real small. But soil is sand, silt, and clay. If you have these three particles, you've got pretty good soil. So how do they give you those things of water retention, um, permeability, and all that? So what we know about soil is soil has a negative charge. Most soil particles have a negative charge. There are some soil particles we've heard in the tropics that don't have any charges, but for the most part, quartz, pieces around like this, and the feldspar have negative charges. And a water molecule is two oxygens, I'm seeing one oxygen and two hydrogens. And this side is negative, this side's positive. So water is it's got its charged particle. It's got charges. Oxygen negative on this side. Hydrogens are kind of stuck on the other side, and they're negative. So what happens is this is attracted. The positive parts of the water molecule are attracted to each soil particle. So each soil particle, when you water it, and even if it's just humid, a layer of water just clings to its surface. And you can see the smaller the particle, the more of the more volume per size of particle the water is held. So they say molecules of feldspar or clay may only be 28 molecules thick, yet they have a molecule of water, at least one layer on them. Generally, if you're watering your soil, several layers of this water just get stuck. It could be, it could be 10 layers of water get stuck to this, but the last layer is the one that's stuck the hardest. That's the one that maybe only tomatoes can pull. I don't even think tomatoes can pull that last bit off. You've got to bake the soil to get that last layer of water off it, so that tomatoes can pull more water off it. Some plants cannot. But clay, for its volume, holds a lot more water. So they say if you have if you have this sandy soil, the amount of water it takes to soak all of it, so that to the point of runoff. So it's about a half inch of water per foot. Sand will hold in the soil as the water goes through the sand. About a foot of it will hold about a half inch water, and then it just runs through below that. Whereas if you have clay soil, it may take 2.5 inches of water to soak an inch deep into that clay. Now, no one's got pure clay, and hardly anyone has pure sand as a soil. It's always, there's some of these other particles in there. But so clay retains water quite well, sand does not. However, the other side of the coin is that plant roots can grow maybe 10 times deeper in sand than they can in clay, because the air is more permeable. The air can get through it. So there's not much difference in as far as plants growing in sandy soil and clay soil. Once they get established and they get the roots where they need to be, the one in sand doesn't need more water than the one in clay, because the water will go deeper in the sand, the roots go deeper too. It's kind of a wash that way. Initially, sandy soil, yeah, if you put that plant in there, you got to water it very frequently in the sand, just because the roots aren't down that far yet. But eventually, there's no difference between the sand and the clay as far as how the plant's doing here. So this is kind of a demonstration of how the soil is made. Now we know if your particles are really round, if they were true spheres, but they're close. I mean, if you look in a microscope, sand and silt are very close to being round spheres. If you have a volume of soil that's filled with these round spheres, these spheres are taking up 2/3 of the volume, and 1/3 is all air spaces between the round particles. So if you have another sand here, the gaps between the particles is 1/3 of the volume. Silt, same thing. The holes are smaller in silt though, so permeability has a lot to do with the size of the spaces. So if you had, big boulders stacked together, yeah, the air flows through there very easily. If you have silt, the same shape, the air flows a lot slower because the size of the holes are smaller. The problem with clay is that it's such tiny holes between clay particles, air has a hard time moving through clay. And if you put water on it on top of that, boy, it's really hard for air to move through clay. Well, here's how the soil is set up. Now, realistically, these tennis balls, which are the sand, should be the size of beach balls. It should be a lot bigger, but I don't have that much room here to show you. And then the ping pong balls in here are the silt. And then the lentil seeds and confetti would be a better substitute for clay. which these lentil seeds are flat, that represents a clay. And you can see if the soil doesn't have so much clay in there, the air gets through real nicely. But if the clay fills all these gaps, suddenly your soil doesn't breathe. And all it takes, 1/3 of the volume of up here is between round particles is air. And if your clay content reaches 1/3, you got clay soil. So it doesn't take much clay to ruin a very sandy soil. 1/3 of that soil is clay, then no more air gaps. And the hills back here, most of these foothills, they call them sandy clay. There's a lot of sand in there, but there's enough clay to fill most of the gaps so that the airflow is really bad. Now, plants don't really have too much trouble with that by themselves. All they do in a heavier clay soil is the roots live closer to the surface. The big problem we're faced with is if you put compost in the ground and try to fix your clay, or you put a plant in there that's got compost in it. Here's the plant that's got compost in it. You see the sawdust in there. You stick that in a hole in the clay soil and it doesn't breathe. As this compost is decomposing, now, you know, I've been told by people that, oh, they only use finished compost because compost decomposes very quickly. If you took a whole bunch of chipped up plant material and put in a big pile, for 3 months it goes through what is called a hot decomposition, real fast. I mean, it's hot enough it can actually catch on fire. And then after that, it cools off, it slows down, but it never finishes decomposing until all that's left is carbon dioxide and water. So no matter what compost looks like, how old it is, if you can still see it, it's still decomposing. It decomposes at a slower rate, but it's still messing up the oxygen flow to the roots. So you put that in a hole in the clay soil that doesn't breathe, and the roots rot. Now, if they weren't in that soil, if they were in our own soil, which doesn't really have that much decomposition going on in it, you can put this straight in clay. There's no problem with that, unless it's too deep. So in clay soil, the air can get down about 8-10 inches. That's about it. And sandy soil can go 3 foot, 10 foot, depends on the sand. So if you have a plant in too big a pot, like a 24-inch box, that's 20 inches of dirt. So 20 roots are 20 inches deep in a 24-inch box, and you stick that in a hole in the clay, you can lose half the root system just because it's too deep in that clay soil. So there are some things you have to do to prevent that, but generally clay is not a problem. I mean, what's interesting is some other terminology used to use. So if you go back 150 years ago, I have a textbook somewhere on my shelf over here about farming in Orange County before the turn of the last, or before 1900. Can't say turn of last century more, that just happened, but before 1900, they had a book written about farming in Southern California. And they mentioned that the best farmland was in Los Alamitos and Fountain Valley because it's clay. So in the old days, before we had irrigation, modern irrigation technology, clay soil was the rich soil because it retained moisture, mainly because it retained moisture. Anytime any soil that can retain moisture also retains some of the nutrients you apply because the water is stuck there. The nutrients are dissolved in the water, so the clay soils held on to water nutrients better than the sandy soils. So the sandy soils that look like this were considered the poor soils because they just were dry. If the rains were over, you couldn't grow a crop in this unless you watered it every day. So this soil has limitations because it would need constant watering, constant light water to keep it moist. The clay soils you can water once a week, once every 2 weeks with the flood irrigation, and your plants were just fine because it was really wet. Nowadays, we know this soil is much easier to garden in because we have sprinklers, we have hoses, things that make it easier to water your garden. And suddenly this becomes the better soil because it's got more airflow to the roots. Whereas in the clay soil, you put the plants that were being sold into clay, they just rot. The roots can't breathe in that. They're rotting with all this compost that we're using. It's causing a lot of trouble. So that's our big problem. Now, the reason we got stuck this way, so we've known for quite a while that organic matter is important to nutrition of plants. I mean, if you go back hundreds of years ago, people used human manure, cow manure, things like that to fertilize their plants. Now, farms are usually out in the open. That's one of the problems that farms have. They're usually out in the open. There's no windbreaks. And the farmers found if they just scattered, this stuff on top of the ground, the wind would just blow it away. If it was dry, they'd blow it away. Of course, it smelled better too if they plowed it in. So they plow it into the ground to make the soil richer. Now, most farmland is better soil than nowadays than most of us have. But also it's the volume they turned in. So we know that we've watched farms in this area apply the compost over the fields and plow it in. When you look at how much they're putting on, it's roughly 5 yards per acre. You spread 5 cubic yards. A yard is a pile 3 by 3 by 3. You spread that over an acre, it's like that thick. You can see it, but the thickness is less than an eighth of an inch. It's hardly there. I mean, it's a lot, but it's hardly there. So when they turn it in, the volume of organic matter soil is very low. Whereas you look at a bag of planter mix that you buy any place, they said 50-50. 50, you want to make your soil 50% organic. That's pretty deadly. So the University of California back in 2000, well, back in 1950, they did a survey of farms in California. In fact, back in those days, they did a survey of the world in general as far as how much organic matter is in the soil. So natural organic content. That's dead stuff mixed into the soil in the world is supposed to be 0.9%. That ain't much. That's that's essentially one root every so many inches going through the soil that died. That's how you get your dead organic matter in the ground. University of New Hampshire about 5 years ago disputes this. They said it's zero. When they went through the soil very carefully, trying not to kill things that are in the soil, they couldn't find anything in the soil that was organic, that had died. They said, things die, they're eaten up immediately by the soil organisms. So there's not much dead stuff in the ground. But anyway, overall, whole world, they say 9.9%. And that's essentially what you're seeing here. This is soil that's maybe 0.9% organic. Well, actually, this is off the farm. So the University of California went around the farms in 1950, and they said, we're finding that amount of organic matter in soil. They went around again in 2000 to check up on the farmers to make sure they weren't losing that. They said, farms in California, perfect, 1.1%. You can't see that. That's hardly anything, but that it is important that it's there. It's important to have dead organic matter soil because that supplies nutrition. That's one of the ways we supply nutrition to the soil is to have that around. So it's important, but you don't want too much. So they did say that they surveyed some farms and in the Delta regions and near Sacramento, the inland Delta there are some farms that are on reclaimed marshland. That marshland is almost pure peat. I mean, peat is just dead reeds and grasses that have built up at the bottoms of ponds and things over hundreds of years. And they said the soil on these farms is up to 40% organic. And they said those farmers cannot grow anything except for seasonal crops. Crops only last a few months, and they have to manage the water very carefully because things rot real easy in that bog that they're in. So you can't grow permanent things like trees or shrubs, and you have to manage your watering. Well, yeah, they can easily overwater their plants when they're in that much organic matter. And that's what we're causing when you put compost in the ground and put it in. Yeah, now you have to manage your watering because if the ground okay, so when the soil is saturated, that means all the air spots between the particles is now full of water. Now, if you've got dead stuff mixed in with this, then the oxygen is being used up in the water. And because the water between soil particles is not free to circulate, eventually this oxygen gets used up in this water and the plant would start to suffocate. That's what causes suffocation. The water can't move, the air can't move through it too well either because there's too much water in here. And the oxygen level drops too low and the roots start suffocating. So if the water drains out, the air can move back in a little easier. So it's not saturated, air can move out much easier, and then the roots can breathe again. So that's what that kind of soil, you have to avoid overwatering because of the fact that you got to get the air back in because the air is being used up by the soil itself on top of what's by the roots. So whereas if it was in a sandy soil, especially if it's a very sandy soil, you can keep that thing in water and nothing really happens because the air moves and the water moves freely and the air moves freely through the sand and the sand's not consuming the oxygen. Any questions so far? So we're going good here. So anyway, so what's sandy loam? The ideal soil, which is generally found along the big riverbeds in Orange County. So all on the Sandy River within a mile on each side, say. Uh, Anaheim is great soil there. It's all this kind of soil. Any river beds, there's a lot of riverbeds that have it. With sandy loam means that the content of the loam has a lot of sand in it. So let's put down sand. So you play it's like at least around 50-60% sand, maybe 30% silt, and maybe 10% clay. But these numbers can get all over the place. As long as the clay content doesn't get close to like 20%, you still have fairly sandy soil. Now, rich loam be when you're around closer to 20% clay, maybe say 15 to 25% clay, and the sand and silt could be almost anywhere. You've got enough clay in there that your soil is holding on to quite a bit of water. And then you have clay soil, clay loam, if you want to call it that. That's anytime your clay content gets around 33% or higher. We've been told by the Ag Department there's no soil in Orange County that's more than 50% clay. They said they get close to 50% clay, they don't get above it, which means that you can have the worst clay soil in Orange County. You can mix equal parts of sand to it, and it's no longer clay soil. Whereas a lot of nurserymen in the area have no idea what they're talking about. They'll tell you, mix sand and clay soil, you'll get concrete. It's like, come on. These are all components of good soil. They're not, to make concrete, you got to have cement. Clay does not make good concrete. Clay does not. So anyway, um, these are, so you got sandy clay up in the hills here. The rivers wash them down. The soils close to rivers. See, sand falls out of the rivers faster, so close to the riverbeds you get a lot of sand, and then clay stays in the water longer because it's so light it floats, and then it settles out in Fountain Valley and Los Alamitos. Anywhere close to the ocean, the clay settles out, and then you got the clay soils out there. I mean, some areas near the riverbeds are still sandy, but most of that flat ground out there is more clay. That's the soils in Orange County. So generally, no matter what soil you have, the plants can do well if you don't mess them up. And if you don't put plants in there that are already messed up. Next week, we'll talk about how to fix the plants that have all this sawdust in them. But today, we're going to go a little bit deeper onto soils. And I think right now we'll switch to what makes potting soils different than the ground. So this soil, which is kind of perfect in your garden, doesn't work too well in the ground. I mean, in a pot, especially if your pot is a non-porous material, it it hangs on to water too much. So soil is like a sponge. It hangs on to water, and the ground itself is essentially a series of sponges going infinite deep. So here you've got the sponge, and you can see the water in there, but then you got another sponge underneath that, and then you have another sponge underneath that, so the water just moves from sponge to sponge to sponge until it's gone. I mean, you can have a perched water table. So a perched water table is what messed up Bluebird Canyon back, I guess it was in the 80s when it slid. So each kind of soil has a different tendency to hold onto water. Sand doesn't hold water very strongly. You know, a half inch per foot is about it. Clay holds onto water a lot. So if you have a soil this is the way Bluebird Canyon was set up. They said it was sand on top of clay, on top of sand in their soil profile there. So the rains got the sand wet, went right through the sand, hit the clay. The sand below it wouldn't absorb the water. So this clay layer became like butter or like oil, and the top just slid right off the hill. So that's the perched water table. When you have clay sitting on top of sand, the water sits here in the clay because the clay has a high affinity for the water. The sand doesn't. The clay gets stuck up there. So the problem we have with containers is that containers don't have any affinity to water unless they're clay. So you have the soil sitting in your pot. There's a perched water table in there. Now it's not necessarily, it's never a problem if it's our soil. If you put our soil in and you have a perched water table, no problem with that. There's plenty of oxygen in the water. If you've got the soils that these growers use, then this water is going to be devoid of oxygen shortly, and this water down here can then rot the roots of the plants. So you have to make sure that there's not much perched water table in there. So the coarser the soil is, the smaller the perched water table. So soil in a pot generally has to be coarser than soil on the ground to do the same thing. So there's no perched water table. So back in the 1950s and 60s, my dad grew his plants in containers full of sandy loam. This drained well enough. I mean, it has a perched water table probably about 2 or 3 inches high, but because there was no dead things in it at the time, it was fine. The plants took 3 or 4 hours to drain. I can remember I go around the when I was a kid, we go around and look at the pots after the workers had watered them. There was water sitting in there for hours. But because this was pure soil and the water still eventually drained close to being out, there's no issues. In the 1960s, the ag department said, well, we got to do something. Our plants are too heavy. You know, if you had a true 5 gallon buckets in those days were maybe the same dimensions of this was called a number 5 today, but they were squared off. They weren't round like cylinders. They were square and they were a little taller, a foot tall and 10 inches wide by 10 inches wide, a foot tall, true 5 gallons. And you put dirt in that, you know, this soil, real dirt weighs about over 100 pounds per cubic foot. And that there was close to half a cubic foot, 50 pounds. So they said, we got to make this light enough for people to carry it. So the first suggestion was peat moss and sand. Well, peat moss has always been pricey because it's shipped down from Canada. So they said, well, let's look for a different thing because peat moss is expensive. Now, peat moss, just so you know, um, reeds and grasses have been sitting at the bottom of a lake for sometimes thousands of years. So they've been decomposing for a while. They can still decompose, but it's a very slow rate. So if you have enough oxygen and it's moist, they say it takes about 5 years for peat moss to decompose, which is quite slow, quite slow. Whereas if you have compost and you keep it moist, 4 months, gone, absolutely gone, totally decomposed. So peat moss is relatively slow decomposing. So that was a suggestion back in the 1950s and 60s. And actually, Cal State Fullerton still uses that mix, sand and peat 50-50. It works. It's lighter than, not by much, you know, it's 50% sand. It's still pretty heavy, but it's lighter than real dirt, and it works. But because of the price, they started looking for alternatives. And one of the alternatives they came up with, which wasn't too bad, is what this company's doing now, redwood sawdust. So redwood sawdust, redwood shavings are, redwood is one of the slowest decomposing woods known. And they say shaving 7 years, so even slower than peat moss. So it's still decomposing, but not very fast. This grower, which is the best grower we can think of other than ourselves, 75% redwood sawdust, 25% sand. They say, and they brag about it because they said their plants are better looking than any other grower's plants in the trade. And I would have to agree with them. For most of the plants they grow, they look pretty good. Not as good as ours, but they look pretty good. And that's what, so when I was a kid, we noticed in the 60s, I was playing my dad's dirt pile, and suddenly, what's this in our dirt pile? We can't make good roads out of it anymore. They're adding redwood sawdust to the soil mix that they're using. And in the 60s, that worked for us. It decomposed so slowly, and they're only using maybe 30-40% redwood, not 75% like this company. So it did, it helped with the weight and it didn't hurt the plants that bad. So in the 60s, 50s, 60s, my dad used to tell me, I was in, I was in middle school by that time. He said, yeah, this industry is real easy. You water plants every day and you fertilize every once a month. Plants grow, make a lot of money. So the 60s went by and no problem. 70s, most 70s went by, but toward the late 70s, the problem was that redwood, by that time, they had cut down all the original redwood forest, and the only good redwood left was in the national parks, which they weren't cutting. So the price of redwood shot real high up. So they said, we got to find something new now. So they went to fir shavings. And fir shavings aren't like redwood at all. They can decompose in half a year. So what we saw is that when my dad was growing plants in the 70s and 80s, you put the soil this high in the pot, and by the next year it was like down here. We're going, well, this is strange. Our soil is now dropping off really fast, and we're starting to see more and more root rot problems. So in the 1980s, my dad finally he couldn't figure it out anymore. He called up the ag department. The ag department came in and told him, "You can't water your plants every day. You're going to rot them." Now that's when I joined the business, and my dad told me, "You figure this out because I've watered all my plants every day for the last 30 years. We never had a problem." And suddenly we have a problem, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. So he turned over to me. It took me like 8 years to figure. I mean, I wasn't that smart back then. So the first 10 years of my nursery career, starting in the '80s, I listened to everybody else, and then at around 10 years in, I go, they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. So yeah, we're having trouble. All the potting soils in those days were ground up for bark. That was the primary thing. And the problem we had in the industry is the plants are using to check their soil. So the plants are using as a sign of goodness. If the tomato grows in it, it must be good soil. We've seen tomatoes growing in pure compost piles, and we've seen them growing in pure manure. They can grow in anything. And they're using this as the role. If they said if our soil can grow a great tomato, it must be really good soil. Well, they should have used lavender or gardenias, not tomato. If tomatoes will grow in real, oxygen poor soils, they make it. I mean, not every single tomato can make it, but in general, tomatoes genetically can handle really bad soil because we've seen it. We've seen, like a friend of mine at Orange County Farm Supply grew tomatoes in pure chicken manure. Well, yeah, they can do it. So that's the plant use. I mean, we're at a potting soil research meeting at UCLA back 20, 30 years ago. I can't remember how long ago. And the professor was um, they were testing different potting soils in the trade and a potting soil of their own making. And they showed us pictures of all these different plants they're using in the test. Well, the only plant that survived at all in any of the tests was impatiens. All the other plants that they were testing all died in all the tests. They died in the pots, and they said, "Well, there's something wrong with these other plants, so we'll stick with impatiens." That's because impatiens could live in sewage too. So they lost their ferns. They lost the ferns. We know that. I remember that was one of the plants. Ferns can't handle compost in the soil, so these all died, and two of the other plants all died in all their container plants. The only one that made it in all their tests was impatiens. So that didn't prove much at all to us. They can only grow impatiens in the different potting soils that were being. It's so sad. I mean, they blamed other problems other than the plants. They blamed the plants. They said these plants, they're hard to grow in pots. So they had to go and use the plants that are the most poor soil tolerant or poor oxygen tolerant of all to do their testing. And then they also told us, well, the thing about potting soil in the United States is that everywhere except for southern Florida and southern California and maybe the southern tip of Texas, potting soil is only meant to last 5 months. And that's because, say, if you're in Missouri, by April it's warm enough, you put your plant in the pot and put your potting soil in there. But by November, it's frozen to death, it's dead. So the next year, you pull everything out of that pot, put new fresh potting soil in there, away you go for another 5 months. So that's how long the average potting soil made in the United States is meant to last. Either one crop or 5 months, whichever comes first. So, and most potting soils aren't even that good, but tomatoes will last in most through those 5 months and make it. And daisies will, and a number of things will make it. These plants on this side will generally make in their fruit through 5 months, but then that soil is going to be shrinking on it. And so we've seen the research articles by the universities on their potting soil they're making, and most of them nowadays make them out of ground up fir bark. So the research report says, yeah, you got to hot compost this for 3 months because you can't use it until the compost decomposition slows down. Then you have 5 months where it's perfect soil. But by the 8th month, it becomes a toxic medium. And they're promoting this to grow trees and shrubs. And we're going, my God. So they say after those 8 months, the nurseryman has several options. One is to throw the plants away. One is to put them in a bigger container with fresh bark around them. The third one is to make sure it's sold. So that's what most retail nurseries across the United States do. They buy their plants from the other container growers in April and sell and have a fire sale in September. Get them off their property before they die. And then if they die the next year, they just blame the homeowner. You overwatered. Now, a lot of plants, like the ones on this side, on this side, or the bigger, the trees that grow very quickly, they just outgrow the problem. Little business around the roots. In a year or two, they're this big with roots far stretching. They can outgrow the problem, but a lot of plants can't outgrow this problem. Now, the reason this came into being in the first place is because, science, unfortunately, is only as good as the question that's asked and as good as the researcher is conscientious. I mean, we've seen in all fields now where the scientists screw up the research so badly that no one can duplicate it, especially in health sciences nowadays. The research that went on for 40 years, especially nutritional research, is so bad. That's why everybody's obese nowadays, because for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, they told us to eat the wrong foods. And nobody checked up on it because it was the U.S. dietetics, whatever. We won't go that way, but that's the problem. The science can be totally wrong if the questions were wrong that were asked. And the question that was asked to the researchers at the universities was, what soil medium can grow a plant in the pot the quickest? Bark. Because this stuff is doesn't have as much permeability as bark does when it's fresh. So boy, if they're watering it quite often, they can keep this plant in here. The plant will grow much faster than it will in here. But a year later, this can kill the plant. Plant's doing quite well in here. But that wasn't the question they were asked. They wanted to know how to grow a plant in the pot the quickest, and that's bark. Plus, it's really light. Plus, it's really cheap. If you want to make soil lighter, you can take material that's the same as soil, the quartz, and puff it up. Perlite. But perlite's expensive. You can also dig natural perlite out of the ground, pumice, same material as this, much lighter, but it's also more expensive to have this stuff than it is either sawdust or bark. Plus, most growers produced by the universities in the last 40 years have been brainwashed to think that if it's not organic, it can't be any good. You can't grow plants and things that are not organic. Organic has the same connotations as global warming, I think. So if it's not organic, there must be something wrong with it. So, one of the things in the trade now that we find quite puzzling. So if you want your plants to be certified organic, there's less than 10 nurseries across the United States that are certified organic because the certifications are crazy. They tell you you have to grow your plants in something that's not mineral. So we've seen the plants that are certified organic, they look terrible. They're usually growing in this material, coconut coir. And the color's funny, they just don't look right. So they require that those nurseries use something that's renewable. It's like, so this isn't renewable. I mean, this is permanent material. It's never going to change. But but they certify only the companies that grow it in something that's recycled. It's really odd. That's totally messed up. A lot of our industry can't grow organically because this stuff, the plants don't look good in it. A lot of times they're leaning all over the place because it's not stable. Just like this grower, and I'm sure that plant was straight up and they put the stake in straight, but because the soil is organic and it's not stable, everything's starting to lean. And you see that all the time. You see trees and nurseries that have stakes on them, but they're all crooked because the soil is collapsing underneath the plants. So the stake doesn't do a thing. I mean, most of the plants we grow, we don't have to stake them up because our soil doesn't change. Now, I'll go over what. So back in the late 80s, we were getting real frustrated because I knew if someone wanted me to put a fern in a pot with the potting soils we're using, it was going to die. No matter what potting soil I used for it, it was going to die. I knew it was going to die, and I just didn't want to do that for our customers. So we were real frustrated back then. I met up with a soil scientist, and I'm glad I did. And he didn't work for the University of California, which is a good thing, because the University of California wouldn't listen to him at all. But he was a scientist working for NASA, putting potting soil into the space shuttles. And he told me, your industry's crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. And I listened to him because I didn't like what we were doing. The things we were promoting, planter mix, the more the better, nothing seemed to be working right. So I listened to this guy and he says, yeah, uh, soil is not organic. So he showed me what he was working with. He said he got the idea because he was surfing in Hawaii. He was getting paid a lot of money, something. And he noticed the islands were just covered in pumice rock and the plants were growing great. So he said, yeah, the soil is not organic. Pure volcanic rock. The plants do wonderful on it. So he showed me his potted plants. He had found this pumice in this volcano. He owned the rights to pumice in this volcano in New Mexico. And the pumice was so light, when you put your hand and blow on it, it would just float. He said this is what we were going to use in the spatial. However, floating was no good. So they switched it to spun glass, which kind of resembles something like this. So, because, in the spatial zero gravity, all the pumice would be floating around the cabin that wouldn't work. So they switched to spun glass for the spatial. But he was growing plants in pure pumice. Now, pumice is used by the hydroponic industry. And some people would say, well, there's something wrong with that. There's no nutrient value here. You got to fertilize like crazy. Um, but the plants he had were totally spotless. Now he had the first thing he wanted to convince me without telling me what was going on with the soil. So he said, "Bring your most difficult plant that rots the easiest, and I'll show you what's going on." So it happened to be a papaya. I don't have a papaya in here right now. Say this was a papaya plant because we knew at that time, we're using super soil and vanity potting soil as our best potting soils. You watered that papaya 2 days in a row, it would just rot, turn yellow, and fall over. It was that sensitive to the potting soils and the water. So he got me to take the plant out of the pot, and he gave me an ice pick to start taking the soil off, but watch what your plant does. So I started taking the soil off. It's kind of slow. The first time I trying to be real careful not to break up the roots too badly. But about a half hour later, it was night and day. So my papaya plant, I brought in, the leaves were like this. And then a half hour later, picking off the soil that was primarily compost, the leaves went like this. I was going, boy, that plant looks a lot happier now. It happens that fast. You get that compost off the roots, and the leaves just wake up, and it's crazy. And people who've done this, because most of our customers know me a long time, they do it with every plant. They do this. Yeah, as soon as they take that stuff off, the color changes. They get greener. It's like they're holding their breath in the compost, and they can't get their green. And it's actually because the roots are suffocating in there. They can't do their work. They can't pull the nutrients out of the soil and all that. But it's so quick that they recover after you get that compost off the roots. This is crazy. And we don't know why other nurserymen haven't figured this out. I mean, nobody. They all go by what they're taught at the universities. So there's no nursery we know of. Now there's some nurseries that do a much better job. So especially the people who propagate plants. So we get a lot of plant material from the companies that start the cuttings and start the seeds and all that. Well, they know that this junk will kill their plants. It just rots them. So they have to use something better. So most of them use peat moss and perlite. Well, all the good ones use peat moss and perlite as a mix to start cuttings and seedlings, tissue culture. This mix, or just pure peat. In small pots, peat breathes well enough. In bigger pots, it doesn't breathe well enough for the air to get to the middle of the big pots. So don't use pure peat in big pots. But in really tiny pots, this size or smaller, pure peat there's enough air in here that you can get by with, but a lot of them use that mix. So there are a few growers around that use a mix called 80-20. It's about 80% peat, 20% perlite, which is really good for the first year. So there are some nurseries. We don't have access to them. I think one of them might be Kent's. I can't remember the name of it now. They sell to a lot of chain stores in the area. But they use peat and perlite because they've always done it, always worked. We used to have several growers that used peat and perlite. No problems. We can water their plants as often as we liked, even if they're wet. You can water them. They never had any problems. But I don't have a single plant nursery now that does this mixture, so that all went out of business because this is more expensive than this thing. So, but yeah, there's a few around, and there's some potting soil being sold that are this 80-20 mix, and sometimes 70-30 mix. Fox Farm has a few. Sun Grow is another potting soil brand that can make it, but they also have their cheaper versions that have recycled forest products, which would be bark or wood. So be careful with that. When you look at potting soils other than ours, if you see recycled forest products, you're getting this stuff, and then your plants can rot in it. Doesn't take much of that to cause rot. Now, what's interesting is the size of the particles plays a big difference. So, like, if a tree falls over in the forest, it may take 100 years for that thing to decompose. We know the trees that fell in the Spirit Lake up near Mount St. Helens when it exploded, they're still floating in the lake. What is it now, 40 years later? They're 50 years. They're still floating in the water. They haven't decomposed yet. So trees in nature, when they fall over, they can take centuries to decompose. But if you grind it up in small pieces, it can be gone in 3 months. So the smaller the piece, the faster things decompose, because for this volume of the particle, there's more surface area. Every time you make something half the dimensions, it's got twice the surface area per volume. That's how things work. So the smaller the particle, the faster it decomposes, just because it has more surface area per volume. Um, so, there's some people on the internet saying, well, my potting soil is better. It's bigger pieces of wood, and it hasn't been decomposed yet, so it lasts longer. So they're trying to do the same thing with non-permanent materials because it's fresher and bigger pieces that last longer. It doesn't, it's eventually going to come to the same problem. So so the problem with things like bark as they decompose, not only are they consuming oxygen, but they tend to be more porous. They hold on to more water. They lose their shape so that they're no longer as permeable. So the permeability goes down, the porosity goes up, and they've always been using oxygen. Whereas if you have sandy loam, nothing changes. It may not have been as permeable as this, but it's always going to be permeable. The same permeability. It's not using any oxygen. And the porosity doesn't change either. Whereas this gets more and more porous as it ages. A lot of the people in our trade will tell you this stuff decomposes and disappears. Well, if you don't have enough oxygen, it doesn't do that. It turns into sludge, which is what's in a bog. So if you bury this, you just get, an area of your garden that'll never grow plants again. If you aerate it, constantly aerate, like in compost pile, yeah, it'll disappear. It'll turn to carbon dioxide and water. But if there's not enough oxygen around, it can stay around for a long, long time and not be good. So one of the things we warn about people is um, don't buy anything called topsoil. Because, true topsoil in nature is essentially sandy loam on the surface. But the people who own tractors and trucks and big facilities don't know anything about plants. I mean, they know about tomatoes. They put tomatoes in it. But they think if you take this soil, which is perfect, and make it 40 to 50% compost, either manures, ground up wood, miscellaneous other mulches, then suddenly you have the best soil. So you buy anything called topsoil from a bulk soil supplier or anything in a bag called topsoil, you have a soil that tomatoes will grow in and everything else just rots away. And I learned this because I called up my local soil supplier back in the 90s, right around 1990, before I knew this stuff. So I learned all this stuff around 93. But 1992, I bought a house and we had all these raised plants. I need 170 cubic yards of soil, 17 truckloads of soil I needed to fill my raised beds. I wanted a great production garden in the backyard. So I called the local guy. I told him, what do you put in here? And he said, our topsoil. So I had that delivered, put in those raised beds, planted my plants. They looked good for a while. And then one by one, things started rotting and falling over. And going, my water's too much. What's going on? I didn't have any problems at the first house I lived at until I met the soil scientist that says, you can't do that to your soil. It took me 10 years to remove 170 cubic yards. So I really got that lesson beat into me. 10 years, I removed a half a yard a week, threw it in our trash bin. You can only hold, half a yard. Otherwise, they fine you for being too heavy. So it took me 10 years to I got rid of about 150 yards because my apple trees would grow in it just fine. My roses grew in it just fine. My lawn grew in it just fine, but couldn't grow citrus or avocados or anything else. I was trying to grow vegetables when they didn't even like it. And when we were pulling that soil out of my backyard, what we noticed, even the weeds would grow about one root every 6 inches through that soil. And I had more roots growing underneath it in the native clay then are in that soil. There are some roots growing at the surface where they can breathe better, but in the middle of it, maybe one root every 6 inches. Replaced it with the sandy loam soil. Dug up the sandy loam soil 3 months later, one root every 1/4 inch. So in healthy soil, you get one root every 1/4 inch. In this topsoil stuff, I was getting one root every 6 inches. That's 24 times more root density in this than it was in that. And when you get plants that are in pots full of compost, especially if they've been in there, and not even if they've been in there a while. So most of these plants have a core in the middle that's peat moss and perlite because the original propagator knew that that's what they had to use. So you usually have good roots going down the center of this pot. And then in pots, because this plastic expands and shrinks with heat, there's always an air gap around all the sides. So what you see is the roots going out the bottom and come up the sides and across the top. But you find vast areas in the middle of this with no roots. You find the roots going down the middle, off to the sides and back up to the top. And I've dissected so many plants that we see this all the time. And some of the growers who mix their own soil, they don't mix it very well. So sometimes you got real dirt on one side, compost on the other. All the roots are on the side with the real dirt. Nothing's in the compost. And for some reason, they don't check. Okay. So anyway, we decided to make our own soil. So we had seen how good plants can grow in pure pumice. I mean, fabulous in pure pumice. Uh, but we knew, well, let's go back a step. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the sandy soil that I grew up with was as good as it was. So we got these pretty good sized pots, like 18-inch pots and fill them with different soils. The potting soil at the time, the best one was our Whitney Farms Uncle Malcolm's blend. So put that in one pot, put sand in another pot, and in the Uncle Malcolm's pot, and the plant we used was strawberry plants. I don't know why I used strawberry plants, I just happened to have them. So I put the strawberry plant in Uncle Malcolm's, and it turned out about this big, which is what we were used to. That's when we grew plants, strawberries in pots with potting soil. They grew about 8 inches wide, and strawberries about that big. That's what we're used to. When you put them in sand, we got something that looked like this. So we looked at the one in the potting soil and the one in the sand. We're going, we're selling poison. That potting soil we're selling was of negative value. The one in the sand, 2 foot across, leaves were huge. They were, the leaves were bigger than the plants in the potting soil. We couldn't believe the difference. So this is pure sand. We What's interesting about sand is if you have a little hole at the bottom, it's like an hourglass. If it's dry, it just keeps running out. So we put this plastic bag in here, punch holes in it to just keep the sand there until we got it wet. But pure sand grows beautiful plants, just like my dad had grown. There's nothing wrong with what he did. But boy, we're just going, okay, we can't sell sand as soil. It's too heavy. What are we going to do? So he said pumice is the lightest natural version of quartz. So we knew that we would use this as our base, but dried out a little too fast. We'd have to water twice to keep the plants looking good. So I asked the guys at UC Riverside, what natural material stores water the best for plants? Now, clay stores water the best, but the plants can't get it off the clay. So clay is not as good a storage material as peat moss. So peat can hold a lot of water and it'll let it go. When the plants want it, it comes off pretty easy, whereas clay holds on real tight. Plants can't get most of it off the clay. So peat and pumice is a pretty good mix. So that was our first try, and it worked so well. For most of what we wanted, that we put it in a bag and we thought, okay, it's peat moss, pretty acidic, so we called it our acid mix. We were going to change the name, but people loved it so much. I said, no, no, don't change the name. We want to make sure we get the right stuff. So our acid mix potting soil is half peat moss and half pumice, and everything grows well in it and has to this day. It's just that at 50% peat, because the peat is decomposing, and it might just be settling down too when it's wet, that we tend to lose about 15% volume the first year. So later on we made a soil that was less shrinking. So this is the strawberry in our acid mix. So it looks about as good as the one in sand does. Much better than the one that was growing in Uncle Malcolm's. So the peat isn't perfect. I mean, it is decomposing. It does steal a little bit of oxygen, but as far as we've seen over the years of use, I can set this strawberry in a deep saucer of water and just let it soak it up. It can stand in the water all its life and it's fine. We've done that. About 10 years ago, I had 10 of these in deep saucers in my backyard. That was my strawberry crop. This happens that when the strawberries are hanging in space like this, the birds can't get them. And if you have a moat around them, the snails can't get to them, and the pill bugs can't get to them. So sitting in a tray of water really worked for us at that time. So they can be in water. I had a cyclamen. Cyclamen are these plants that are real sensitive to rot because of the growers. But we had a cyclamen in our acid mix in a tray of water for 7 years nonstop blooming. The plant looked great for 7 years. We finally sold it. Good. Okay, we've had this long enough. I don't need any more proof that water won't hurt the cyclamen. So we wanted to make a soil that didn't shrink. So we made our top pot. This is our best seller today. And it's about a third peat. Our top pot. Now, when we came up with this name 8 years ago, 9 years ago, our distributor says, you can't call it that. And now they tell us, well, that's a great name. Now that marijuana is legal, it's like, it's a great name for yourself. I mean, I don't think my wife intended for that purpose, but she wanted to call it top pot. Anyway, um, so top pot, and we want to make sure it didn't shrink and that we can grow gardenias. And so gardenia was our plant. We put a gardenia in the soil mix, and it was in there for 5 years. And go, okay, this plant still looks good, No, no yellow leaves, nothing's going on. It must be good soil. So it's what it is, and we don't keep it a secret. 35% peat, 30% humus, 20% perlite, 10% sand, 5% charcoal. So all these are inert materials, essentially mineral. I mean, charcoal is not mineral, but it's inert. So at 60, at 2/3, essentially 2/3 inert material, just like the silt and the sand particles in here, the peat moss is essentially now sitting in these gaps between the pumice and the perlite. So even though the peat moss is still losing volume, it doesn't seem to make the soil shrink because it's not part of the volume. Or at least it seems not to be because the soil doesn't seem to shrink. Now, it's also could be because the plants make roots that make up for the loss of peat moss. The roots and plants are not unlike strands of peat. So it could be as the plants grow, they make up the volume, but we just don't see our soil shrinking much now that we're at 1/3 peat. We also think, again, it's because the big pieces of soil in here, the peat moss is not holding much volume anyway because it's sitting between the gaps. So that's our top pot. Now there's no magic here. I mean, the only reason there's only 10% sand is because these bags already weigh 40 pounds. And if it's El Nino up north where they're bagging it, they can weigh 50 pounds a bag, even without having any, if that was sand, it'd be over 100. So we're about half the weight of sand, but that's still heavy. And I put more sand in there, it's going to be a lot heavier, but I don't mind. I mean, we've seen pure sand do wonders. So you can do this mix. You can go all, from anywhere from here to pure sand. You can go anywhere from acid mix to pure sand. You'll still get good results. Now, the one thing that peat moss does in the soil that is nice too is peat moss is good at wicking water. What that means, if you have a pot full of sand and you drip water here, the water just goes like that. But if you have peat moss in this mix, the water tends to spread out quite a bit. So that's one good reason to have either clay. Now, vermiculite is like the perlite version of sand. The perlite is popped sand essentially, and vermiculite is popped clay. So if you put vermiculite in this mix, it'll act like clay. Just don't go too high. We don't want to get more than maybe 5% vermiculite in here. So in the future, if I wanted to make a soil that didn't have any peat, we can put vermiculite in instead of peat, but I wouldn't go 35% because this acts like clay. It is clay, so it'll gum up the whole works at 35%. So you'd have to keep this right around 10% maybe, but this holds water quite well. That's another option.
You mix it with your cop pot, is that what you do?
You could, if you want to retain more moisture, or just put real dirt in the pot.
What's best for potted plant?
There's no best thing. It depends what you're doing. I mean, okay, so there's an article I read a long time ago. So we used to get articles from Holland. So Holland does a whole bunch of container growing research because their whole industry is hothouses. I mean, they supply most of Europe with cut flowers and vegetables and all that. So they've done hordes of research on container growing. And so the materials that they use for containers, well, rock wool is one, and you already know why they do that. Clay pellets is supposed to be the best. Now, this is interesting. So it's fired clay. So clay holds water. But because it's fired, there's also a lot of gaps in there. So this is one of the best material. It's expensive, but the most expensive crop in the world, most of their growers use, the most expensive crops. You might as well use the most expensive, the best material that you can to grow it. That's marijuana. So most marijuana growers that know what they're doing use clay pellets because this is the best of both worlds. It's clay, so it holds the water, but it's very hairy clay. The pumice is used so this is essentially hydroponics. Perlite's used, sand is used. They don't use DG or sandy loam because it doesn't breathe well enough. So on plants, the more air you get to the roots, the faster they grow. The more water you get to roots, the faster they grow. You want both. Of course, you want the temperature to be stable too, which doesn't. You don't have to worry about that in a hothouse. So these, not enough oxygen. You can do better with those because there's more oxygen on those than with these. But they also use rice hulls. And I would use rice hulls in my mix if our supplier would use it. They say they do not like rice hulls in their factory because you open up a bag of rice hulls and it blows all over the factory. It's too light. Rice hulls, even though they're organic, they just don't decompose. They take forever. The book says the research shows that this is 90% silica. Well, it's almost the same material as this. They said it's a great substitute for perlite, great natural substitute. And there's plenty of rice being grown. So, and they say, they fill the levees near Sacramento with rice holes as a filler. They said you can reach into a levee that was filled with rice holes 50 years ago, and they look fresh. They just don't decompose. So rice holes is used in hydroponic growing. Peat moss is used too. So peat moss, for many applications, they know how long it lasts. See, that's the thing. They have to know how long this will work as a growing medium. So it gives you a good 6 months, 8 months of use, depending on the grade of peat moss. But it's not permanent. But most of the crops are growing are just temporary crops. So they can use things like peat moss also. And coconut, they said, can last almost as long as peat. So coconut core, which is the husk of a coconut torn to shreds, can also work as a growing medium, although we do not like this at all. When we've grown plants in this, the leaves come out relatively orange colored, which is really strange. They look orange to us. We're going, this is weird. What's causing the orange color? So, but we've seen avocados growing this. Their leaves are orange too. So we don't know exactly why. But what's interesting is they said because Europe invented the wood pallets, a way of transporting goods, pallets and forklifts. So they said they had a lot of old wood around. So they spent years trying to work wood as a growing medium and or bark because it's cheap, and they couldn't make it work. They said the problem with wood and bark is that the material is not uniform at all. So if you have a piece of wood, they said this portion here can decompose in 3 months, this portion can take years. It's just not uniform enough to use as a growing medium. But that's what every nursery in the US uses. Ground up wood, ground up bark. With two exceptions. They use ground up wood and ground up bark as a growing medium. And we know nurseries have told, oh, we lost an entire crop of camellias because of bad bark. Now, this same nursery 50 years ago used soil as good as ours. But when their old grower retired and a new one came on, he totally changed them to bark because that's what he was taught in school. And I talked to this guy for half an hour on the phone one day. This is back in the 90s. And I couldn't convince him because I don't have a PhD that what he was doing was totally, out of this world, essentially. What plants want to grow in ground up dead trees? I mean, when you think about it, compost in dead things, if you want to grow good mushrooms, this is what you use. You want to grow plants, they should be growing in this. But at this point of time, everything's growing in something like this. And they bragged about it in their ads. We grow our plants in the world's finest compost. Now, in my last house I lived at, we planted plants from different growers to see how their stuff would fare. And from three of the largest growers in California, one of them, all the plants we got from died in 3 years. And they're on drip systems, so we weren't overwatering or anything like that. And then from another grower, they all died in 5 years. And from the third grower, they died in 10. All the same plants. From the grower who used peat moss and perlite, they never died. I had them for 20 years. Never died. And from the grower that used some redwood, not much redwood, but some redwood, those never died either. Same plants. They made it. All the life of the time I was at that house, they made it. But the ones that are using bark and compost as their soil didn't make it past, and the longest they hung on was 10. But, yeah. So that's a big problem. So this stuff can affect them for a long time. I mean, when we pulled out some of the plants, the roots in our soil were fine. It was right underneath the stem of the plant where they were totally rotten, right where this was setting. And it could have been, some plants were 5 gallons, some plants were just this 1 gallon size. and we're still having trouble with just that plant. It rotted out. That was enough underneath it to rot it out. Now this particular grower used to be redwood sawdust like that one, and that was our other best supplier. But when the new grower came on, he went to redwood grind. So redwood sawdust versus redwood grind, much different. The problem with redwood sawdust that they were coming up with is that it didn't hold enough water. It was too flaky, it didn't hold enough water. So they ground the redwood to look like peat moss. So it's much finer textured now. The problem is it rots much faster than that. So that might take 7 years to rot. These plants die in half a year now because the redwood ground that fine rots. And I told them about what soil they should be using, and then they came back to me and says, our soil supplier doesn't want to use rocks. It messes up their machinery. They'd rather use wood. So that's another limitation. The people who make soils for the nurseries don't like rocks or sand or anything that might, wear out their machinery. They'd rather use wood. It's so sad what's gone on in the industry across the United States. I mean, 50 years ago, most of the nurseries east or north of us only grew plants in the ground. A lot of them still do. They call it field grown. They actually grew them in the ground. And when you wanted to plant, they would dig them out, wrap in burlap ball. It was called balled and burlapped, and send it to you just as planted in real dirt. You put in the ground, no problems. And that was because if nurseries had plants containers, and say in Missouri you had to plant in pot, and you have to allow on your nursery all winter, it would freeze to death. Anything above the ground froze in a pot. The only places where they don't freeze, Southern California, well, California in general, Southern Texas and Southern Florida, they won't freeze. It doesn't get that cold there. But what they found is that they can make a hole in the ground and drop these in. They call it pot and pot growing. So you put a pot in the ground, you drop this pot right into that pot in the hole in the ground, and it won't freeze. So they asked California, oh, what kind of soil mix works best in these pots? And we told them, ground up bark. So instead of growing plants in real dirt like they've done from millennia, now they grow them in ground up bark, and everybody's suffering from this problem. And so they had to make all these rules up in the last 50 years on what's going on. So the biggest thing now is, the biggest problem that homeowners face, overwatering. And they invented that in the 80s. We had never heard of that before the 80s. Overwatering. Well, out of the water, it's the soil. And then they said, you can't pile compost over too high to the trunks. That's because you're putting compost on top of compost. It just rots everything. So they've invented a lot of things to try to explain the problems, but no one has ever just said, the soil is wrong. And we, to this day, now, to the University of California's credit, we understand that in the last Master Gardeners meeting they have, and the Master Gardeners is how they bring their information out to the public. They did show one of my video classes on soil, because the people who run the class, they know me, and they know that I'm, what we say is correct, because, all the soil books say the same thing. You look at a soil book and say, yeah, soil, sand, silt, and clay. Now, this was a recent edition of the same book for 50 years. It said, yeah, soil, sand, silt, and clay. But lately, they had to add a chapter to the back, growing plants in organic medium, because that's what all the nurseries do. So they had to add that to the book. And of course, what they say in that chapter doesn't correspond to any of their other chapters, saying that you have to have organic matter in the soil to grow plants, when that's not true at all. Now, how nature set up, so you got your soil down here that's at least 99% mineral. The plants are in it. What I left out, 5 inches of depth. Don't know the origins of the word duff, but it must mean dead stuff. So there's, around the world, there's an average of 5 inches dead stuff on top of the soil. And that's where the nutrient bank is. That's where fungus lives, bacteria lives, pill bugs, earthworms, and that's where all the nutrients that most of the plants we grow is in this area, not down here. It's up here. And it can be a lot deeper than 5. 5 inches is the average. Then you go out the desert, it's just quarter of an inch or less. But you go into a rainforest, it's deep. One of my friends went down to Guatemala. They want to see how deep the dead leaves were underneath what the avocado trees was. He told me 5 feet. Dead leaves underneath some of those avocado trees in nature. That's hard to believe, but we know even in the Sierra foothills where they dig out the oak leaf mold, it's deep. It's a couple feet deep underneath those oak trees. So they have a lot of duff on top of the ground. That's the nutrient sink. So the University of California, Davis, the ag division of University of California has always been fine. The horticultural side has been the one that's been crazy or just went off in the wrong direction. It's like I still tell people it's like the emperor's new clothes. They're so sophisticated and gone down the wrong track they can't see the problem with their own eyes anymore. It takes a kid to do it. So anyway, the agriculture side seems to know their stuff. So they went around the Central Valley area, surveying the type of soil they had with what grew, how the soil influenced the plant life. And when they were done with their observations, they said the soil has no influence on the plants that grew. The dead leaves. All the plants needed was a pile of dead leaves, and the same plants grew throughout the area. No matter if the soil was clay, sand, silt, no matter if it was deficient in this material, had too much of this. They said the plants that they were surveying, mostly trees and shrubs, did not get any nutrients out of the soil. It's not the role of the soil. They were getting it out of the dust. Now, the way this works, and we'll go over this more next week, there's a fungus that's in the ground. Called the mycorrhizal fungus. And until they had electron microscopes, they couldn't tell this was here. So what they discovered, what they told us in the 1980s is that 60% of a plant's roots that they thought were the plant's roots aren't. No, I think it was 80% of the plant's root. What they thought was the plant's root system is not the plant's roots at all. It's a fungus attached to the roots. And this fungus is what goes up out of the soil into the duff layer and breaks down most of the stuff. It's not the bacteria. The bacteria in the compost pile do some work too. But they said in nature, this fungus does most of it. 60% or more of it goes up into the dead leaves. It can pull the nutrients out of the dead leaves and put it back in the same tree within 90 days. It's very, very fast and efficient. So in an established yard, they said, well, in established anything, forest, they said the mycorrhizal forest is the king of the ecosystem. All the plants are attached to this one giant mycorrhizal fungi. The mycorrhizal fungus gets the nutrients out of the dead leaves, and the plants are all connected to the same mycorrhizal fungus. It actually can share the water among the different plants, share the nutrients among the different plants in that ecosystem. So they said the biggest organisms on Earth are mycorrhizal fungi. They said they documented one in a forest in Oregon that was 200 yards wide. One fungus attached to all the trees there, 200 yards wide. And what's really bizarre, this fungus expert said that mycorrhizal fungi can transmit electrical impulses. It's like our nervous, it resembles our nervous system. So they said when you walk in a forest, the forest knows you're walking in the forest. That's what they claim. This mycorrhizal fungus can detect you. And plants communicate with each other through this fungus. I mean, I won't go too deep into that part. I mean, that's getting pretty far out there, but so the mycorrhizal fungus is part of the plant's root system. and it's what goes up and gets the nutrients out of this stuff. They said this partnership happened when plants came on Earth from the oceans because the algae and what came ashore couldn't eat the rocks. This fungus could eat the rocks. Now, what the fungus gets out of the plant is the sugars that the plant makes in photosynthesis. Is what makes up most of the body. Cellulose, which is the body of plants, is sugar molecules that are rearranged. So the fungus can grow much quicker being attached to plants. And the plant's getting the water and the mineral nourishment through the mycorrhizal fungus system. Now, it is true that plant roots without the mycorrhizal fungus can absorb water-soluble fertilizers. But when you're using, say, an organic fertilizer, mycorrhizal fungus is doing most of that work. Okay, we've covered quite a bit. Any questions so far?
Question on the mycorrhizal fungus.
Hmm?
Now, it's existing in the ground, in the soil. So we don't, outside of maybe getting a fertilizer like that, we don't have to worry about going out and buying that
Right.
sell it.
So in the 90s, Consumer Reports ran an article that said, so all these companies that are the better fertilizer, organic fertilizer companies, they put mycorrhizal fungi in here, they put bacteria in here, which help break down the stuff. Now, it does have a purpose, but not in the ground. So in the ground, there's, the mycorrhizal spores float in the air, so you don't even have to add them. They eventually get to your yard fairly quickly if they're not there, but they're there. I met the researcher from UC Riverside that went to Mount St. Helens after it blew up that whole area, because there's no mycorrhizal fungus left after in the blast zone. So she told me it took 5 years, I think it was 200 square miles, for the mycorrhizal fungus to totally repopulate the area. That wasn't long for 200 square miles. And they were checking the roots of the fir trees trying to grow back, and they said, yeah, within 5 years, they all had the mycorrhizal fungus back on them. So in the ground, generally, unless it's been underneath the piece of slab underneath the deck for decades, you don't have to add this. But our potting soil doesn't have this in it. At least our acid mix doesn't. This might because it has sand in it, and the sand's not sterile. But so we always add this when we're initially potting up one of these plants, because we don't know if the grower who propagated it added mycorrhizal fungus. They may, and I would say most of them probably do now. But to make sure we add it to our initial planting, some of this, to make sure that they have the fungus in there with them, because that'll certainly help them do better. Now,
And you're using your top, and you're transplanting it to another planet. Can you use your top in that original, or should you use new?
that's next week's class. Now what happens in pots, and this is not a big deal, is that plants grow new roots every year and roots die every year. So eventually, if you have the same plant, the same pot, it's just full of dead roots. So when you go, now if you go from that to a bigger pot, that's fine. It's got more root space now. So plants in general live as long, so the U.S. Forest Department determined that a tree will live as long as its roots can grow further away every year. So if the tree can afford to grow a bigger root system, so it doesn't have to be in the close to the tree where the roots are all dead, it can stay healthy. As long as they can grow roots farther and far, tree roots can grow 3 foot a year or longer. But once they reach their limits, they die quickly. So that's plant health and death is when they run out of good root zones. So most plants, like there's a lot of perennials that only live a few years because after a few years, there's too many dead roots around, they can't handle it. But you can take the plant out of the ground, move it a few feet, put it back in the ground, and they can go again for another 3 years because they have fresh soil again. So that's one way you can do it, is keep moving them to fresh soil. if they can't grow a bigger root system, you just move the plants or put new soil around them. I mean, one of the things that rose gardens do, because rose is generally good for 10 years plus, is they'll put a trench around them and put new dirt in. So they have a new root zone area that's close to them. So they don't have to try to grow roots farther away. But they do say, like a redwood tree, for maybe 3,000 years, it's really healthy. It looks good. It's got that nice shape to it. But eventually it runs out of root space. And when it does that, it can die within 100 years. Rather, in their lifespan, really quickly. They just fall apart real fast and die because if they can't live in clean dirt, they can't find any more clean dirt. It kills them pretty fast.
Can you transplant a soil from a smaller pot to a bigger pot? What I'm talking about is I have the gem of a pot and it's in your pot. And now it's too small and it's bearing fruit. Do I dare transplant it to a bigger pot?
You would rather be in a bigger pot. It's in our soil. Yeah. You can go in the ground, you can go in a bigger pot, there's no issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of plants are a little greedy. So yeah. The problem with big trees, so big trees are always the bully of the garden. It's like I talked to an orchard grower once, and they have those 100-foot tall windbreak trees. I asked him about those. He says, yeah, about every 5 years we run the trencher close to those windbreak trees and cut off the roots because those roots get into our orchard. They just suck all the water and fertilizer out of the orchard. So they're always cutting the roots off those trees to keep them out of the orchard. So anything big like that can take over your garden, especially a vegetable garden. Fruit tree, not so bad, but well, I had problems with the orange trees near 80-foot pine trees. I couldn't keep them watered.
Transplant because the root is more important. I mean, that's good on her trees.
Yeah, no, that's fine. As long as you don't knock them off in the process, there's no issue with that. The plant would rather be in more soil. Now, one other thing, improving your soil, it's really hard. So you really can't change clay to a better soil. Now, nature has one way of changing soil. It can change a little bit of it anyway. So if you have clay soil and you want to make it better, the products of decomposition actually can change clay. So as compost and tree parts decompose, so plant material is strands of cellulose held together with a glue called lignin. Cellulose is a sugar molecule that's rearranged so no one can eat it except for bacteria. And lignin is also a sugar molecule that's rearranged, but it's real sticky. So when these things decompose on top of the ground, the lignin is released into the soil, which is real sticky stuff. So what happens is all the clay particles and even sand, whatever, is stuck together into bigger chunks. So the clay, instead of being this real fine, powdery stuff that gets real gooey and all, is cemented together into these bigger pieces. They call it granulation or aggregation of the soil particles. And we noticed that, yeah, you put certain things like nitrohumus, which is digested human sludge on the ground, the soil below it suddenly turns into little pills. It's gluing all those soil particles together into bigger pieces. So that's how compost can improve clay soils, but you want to make sure you put the compost on top so it can decompose readily and properly, and then it will help with clay below it to make it more permeable because it glues it into bigger pieces. So that can work. There are things called humic acids, supposedly, that are lignins that you can spray on the ground. That'll do it too. But just putting a lot of compost or decomposable things on top of the ground will help that soil aggregate or granulate below it. So you get some better texture to your clay soil. They said in nature, what creates soil that's like Swiss cheese is the plant roots, the mycorrhizal fungal roots, make a web in the ground, and then the earthworms and the other, well, there's a lot of, there's no earthworms native here. There's microscopic worms called nematodes that live here. They punch holes through all this stuff. The roots and the fungus roots are holding everything together. They said your soil becomes like Swiss cheese after a while if you just leave it alone. With compost on the top or something to, dead stuff on top. Don't turn it over. Leave it alone. The roots and the fungi and everything will make your soil very airy over time. And again, there's really nothing wrong with clay except for the plants we're putting into it, this rot, because of the soil the plants are growing. It's not the plants themselves. They can live in clay. Back in the 60s, when we first moved to this area, and my parents had clay soil, we didn't lose anything in those days because the plants weren't growing in the bad soil. Nowadays, yeah, you put Gardenias in the clay soil, they all just all rot out. But in those days, my dad had azaleas, gardenias, camellias, ferns. He had everything in clay soil, nothing rotted. Clay is not toxic. This doesn't have the permeability that the compost needs to stay nice. That's the main thing. I think I covered all my subjects here. So yeah, you can, sometimes people tell me, well, I have these huge pots to fill. If the weight doesn't bother you, use sand. So we saw documentation on what they used to do. So my dad's bonsai book, he was a bonsai artist. They never used compost for bonsai. I mean, they never even thought of doing that. So they in their book they said sand is the most vigorous growing medium, but that's not what we want for bonsai. They want plants to be stunted and small. So they would add enough clay to the soil to stunt these plants, make small leaves, small branches. I mean, if the soil is bad, in fact, I brought a sample in here of a plant. Well, when roots of plants can't breathe. So here's some blueberries that are in soil that's not doing a great job breathing. It's not bad. It's not killing them, but they're certainly not happy in there. It might be a nutrient problem, but probably a nutrient problem because I can see the fertilizer in there because the roots aren't healthy enough. When we grow blueberries in our soil, they look like that. And this is what I'm getting directly from my growers. Now, some growers don't use quite as bad a soil. They look better for a while. But most blueberries you don't get from us, they usually turn ugly within a couple years and die because those growers have been told, even by the blueberry suppliers, use bark and peat moss.
When you say your soil, are you alluding to the top pot?
This is, well, you can grow them either. We grow them in both. This is in our acid mix.
What's the difference between the top pot and the acid mix?
Less peat moss in the top pot.
Less peat moss in it. So it's longevity is good here, short term is good there.
Right.
Is that correct?
Well, yeah, there's enough permatil in here, it's good forever, but it does lose some volume because the peat moss is flattening out. But there's enough humus in here that the plant will never.
What about houseplants? Replanting houseplants.
Different story. So with houseplants, I usually tell our customers take the top pot and mix it with pumice rock. So more of the rock.
Do you sell pumice rock?
Yes. Small bags and big bags.
If you want to repot your plants in bigger pots, you mix that
with pumice about half and half. Because indoor plants, the water retention is not that important because they're inside the house. They're not exposed to wind or heat. The air to the roots is most important. So you mix this with more pumice, and we see the indoor plants. Plus, it's really stable. Just you get mostly rock in that soil mix. It's very stable. They don't move at all in there. So that's my favorite mix. We'll have to produce a houseplant mix pretty soon, so that people don't have to mix themselves. But that's a good mix for houseplants.
and like to plant your azalea, say out of the pots into the ground. You use the acid mix for that?
We do. We do, because it's more water retention. It's a little more acidic than this, we think. I mean, this one, the pH is around high fives. This one is probably low. It's not that different because, there's nothing in here making the peat moss less acidic. It's because everything else is
For
neutral.
roses, it doesn't matter.
True. We've used either one for roses. This one retains water a little better, so roses use a lot of water, fig trees use a lot of water, things use a lot of water, grapevines, well, sometimes we'll put them in that instead, just because it holds water better in the pot. But again, it does shrink a little bit. Not bad. Doesn't, things don't move too badly in it. No point I'm gonna make this now. Well, the other thing that goes on too is that, well, so when our growers use compost, you can see how far that dirt is falling in there. Because this plant, olives are a little slow growing, so this probably had to be in the pot a year before they could sell it. But in the meantime, they've lost almost a third of the volume of that soil because it was compost in there. So that's what happens.
So Gary,
Mhm.
if I buy a pot for blueberries, for example, out of another district, I'm going to assume it's got compost in it, it's stuff in it.
Right.
So when I get it home and I'm going to repot it, then I'm just trying to take off as much of that part off of it and then put the top on.
Right. So next week's class is going to be on repairing plants, installation process, fertilizing, watering, all that stuff. Yeah, we've changed the soil on tens of thousands of plants over the years just because, we couldn't stand selling them in the soil they came in because we knew what was going to happen. We don't want the customers to be unhappy. So, like, one we changed that we continue to change is this form silver sheen is real famous, infamous. I don't know a single contractor who's been in the business for a while that wants to put these in people's yards because you kind of have to come back in 3 or 4 months and replace them because they're all dying. So that plant, even though the other pittosporums aren't so sensitive, this particular one is super sensitive to compost in the root zone. And they pretty much all, you've seen going in people's landscapes, go, okay, come back in a year, it'll be gone. And generally they are gone. They died. The customer usually blames himself for not doing something right, and that's it. And the other thing we see, a lot of the California natives, so, with the drought we had starting, 10 years ago, they're promoting, California friendly plants. Well, it turns out that most natives weren't making it, so they stopped recommending real drought tolerant plants like the California natives because no one can keep them alive. And one of the reasons for that is that these haven't been in the trade that, like this is white sage. It hasn't been in the trade that long, so if a plant's been in the trade for a while, people usually select the ones that seem to survive better in the containers, which means they can tolerate low oxygen levels in the soil better, and they get rid of the ones that are real sensitive. So if they plant 100 white sages and lose all but one, then they'll keep that one and probably say this is more garden hardy. Well, because they can tolerate their compost better. Well, no one's ever found a white sage that does it real well, so hardly any of my growers grow white sages, but we found that when we grow them, they're a piece of cake. It's like lavenders. Lavenders, to us, has become one of the easiest plants in the world to grow. Hard to kill them. You can let them totally get dry. They look terrible, and you water them, they come back. But you buy them from anyone else, they just rot away. So, and gardenias, super easy to grow gardenias. You can take a branch, you can break a branch off, stick a glass of water, it grows roots. It's that easy to grow gardenias. But none of our growers' plants look like this. They're all small. The leaves are smaller. So when the plants aren't happy, the leaves are usually smaller. They're usually not as colorful. Like we went to this one nursery once, and all their cactus were the same color, all this olive brownish greenish color. You go to a cactus nursery where they know their stuff, and they got blue cactus and green cactus and all different colors of succulents. But the growers who use too much compost, all their plants are the same ugly gray, greenish, orangish color. And we've seen a lot of nurseries the same way. All their plants are the same color, this olive green color. Whereas when we grow plants, you get all the different colors in the foliage they're supposed to. They're more dramatically colored than you know than what we get from our suppliers. So yeah, the soil, we do a lot of fixing of plants and soil. And since we've been doing it doesn't bother us that much anymore to just like with azaleas. Now we grew this azalea, so it's fine. But if we don't grow the azalea, we'll just tell the customer, okay, drop the root ball on the sidewalk, take out the pot, drop it on the sidewalk, get all that soil off the roots, stick in the ground, cut it back halfway. Because all the instructions for bougainvilleas was you got to handle the plant really gently because the root system's so fragile and they're, well, yeah, it's fragile because they don't like the soil you're growing them in. There's hardly any roots on these things if we get them from another grower. So get rid of all that soil, get it off there, and get it into either real dirt or into our soil. So, 5 years ago, we planted some bougainvilleas in front of our pilasters out there. And I told my new employee, I told him what to do. He says, we're going to kill this thing. I said, no, you're not. I told him, just go ahead and do it and watch what the plant does. So he did it. We cut the plants maybe back about a third. He came back 2 days later and says, look, all the leaves are dropping off. I said, that's fine. That's what they normally do. So that's a sign of a plant saving itself. When it's saving itself because it knows it didn't have enough moisture coming up through when you deal with the roots, that takes them 2 weeks to fully recover. So they dropped their leaves off and went bare. And then 2 more weeks later, they started growing a new set. And now those plants can bloom and have leaves year round. Whereas when we used to buy, well, I still buy them sometimes from our suppliers, their plants would always drop their leaves in the winter and stop blooming in the wintertime, like they're dead. And then in spring, when the soil dried up, they would come back to life. And that's what a lot of people see in the yards is their bougainvilleas go to sleep in the winter. Well, you see a lot of bougainvilleas that are fine in the wintertime. They don't have any problem. It's just the soil that we put around them that causes that. So there's a lot of instances like that in the trade where the plants, boxwoods rot all the time now. The boxwoods, which were the original hedges used in the United States. Nowadays, you see all dying boxwoods because they're kind of sensitive to compost too. They're not the most sensitive thing we see, but still, if you put boxwoods in compost, chance of survival aren't that good. And the smaller the amount of compost, the better the chance it has. So, when we buy plants from our growers, we rarely buy big plants because we know that if it's come in a 15-gallon bucket with that much compost on it, forget it. Plant has very little chance of making it.
Will boxwoods grow in this land?
Anything grows in our soil. Trying to think of things we've had the most trouble with. Generally, we have a lot of trouble because a lot of the plants we get from the propagators, which are in pots this big, plants are the same size. A lot of times they come to us, they have trouble to begin with. Like when we grew these leucospermums, about a third of them didn't take. But once they started growing, they're fine.
I have 3 boxwoods I have to replace. I don't know why. I got a hedge, it's big. And right about that much space, they just die.
Yeah,
So that's obviously the soil.
right.
I didn't water any extra because I thought maybe it was running off, I have to replace them.
Yeah, now we don't grow boxwood, so this is not one of ours. However,
See before
yeah. But this one is redwood, so it probably will make it. But now, what's on the line for next week's class too is when we replant the same plant, you got to take out a lot of dirt in that area because it contains dead boxwood roots.
So I'm gonna do.
So, and you can replace with sand or our soil or soil from another part of your yard that's not close to the area, and then it helps. That's called the replant syndrome. So we'll talk about that next week.
I need the replant soon.
That's
I'm big in the
one of the rules of nature. When a tree falls down in the forest, the same tree cannot grow back for 20, 30 years unless there's a hot wildfire. Wildfires sterilize the dirt.
If I wanted to try and grow something in sand,
Mhm.
what kind of sand?
We've used all of them. Clay sand, wash sand, all-purpose sand, concrete sand, plaster sand. The only sand that's a little too fine might be mortar sand, but even that sand, I would think you can grow plants fine in mortar sand too. It's all silica dioxide. Now there's different colors just because different areas where they get sand out of the riverbeds, they've got different minerals in them.
So almost any kind of sand.
Yep.
Yes, I might try that experiment on something that I can't grow in.
And for some reason, it didn't register to me when I was younger, back in the 80s. I had a sandbox. I bought a house with a sandbox, and my strawberries got into it, and they were just incredible looking. And it didn't, for some reason, for the next 10 years, I didn't think about that. That when the strawberries got into the sandbox, they were just incredible.
Just like in the sand.
Yeah. Well, the sandbox sand, they just look perfect. Right. See you next week.
Thank you.